John Singer Sargent walked into that Paris Salon in 1884, thinking his latest portrait would cement his reputation as the greatest society painter of his generation. Instead, one exposed shoulder strap would nearly destroy his career forever and create the most scandalous painting in art history. But let's start at the beginning, because Sargent's story isn't just about one shocking portrait. It's about an American boy who grew up in European palaces, learned to see the world through the eyes of the wealthy elite, and then painted them with such brutal honesty that they both loved and feared him. Sargent was born in 1856 to American parents who had basically become professional travelers. His mother Mary was obsessed with European culture and dragged the family from city to city, never staying anywhere long enough for young John to call any place home. By the time he was 18, he had lived in Rome, Nice, Paris, Dresden, and a dozen other cities. Most kids would have been confused by this nomadic lifestyle, but for Sargent, it was perfect training for what he would become. See, when you're always the outsider looking in, you develop a special skill for watching people. And watching people, really watching them, was Sargent's greatest talent. He could spot the tiny details that revealed someone's true character. The way a wealthy woman held her fan to show off her jewelry. How a powerful man positioned his hands to display his authority. These were the secrets that made Sargent's portraits so magnetic and so dangerous. In 1874, 18-year-old Sargent convinced his parents to let him study art seriously in Paris. He enrolled in the studio of Carolus Duran, who taught his students something revolutionary for that time. Instead of building up paintings slowly with careful drawings and layers, Carolus Duran showed them how to capture their subjects with bold, confident brushstrokes that seemed to dance across the canvas. This technique would become Sargent's signature, but it would also get him into serious trouble. Sargent threw himself into his studies with an intensity that amazed even his teachers. He painted from dawn to dusk, studying every master painting he could find in the Louvre. He learned to speak French, Italian, and German fluently. He dressed like a proper Parisian gentleman and learned the subtle social codes of European high society. By his early 20s, he wasn't just an American tourist painting in Paris. He had transformed himself into someone who could move seamlessly through the world of the European elite, and that elite world was exactly where the money was. In the 1880s, if you were wealthy and powerful, you needed a portrait to prove it. Photography existed, but it was still primitive and formal. A painted portrait was a work of art that would hang in your mansion for generations, announcing your importance to everyone who saw it. The problem was finding an artist who could paint you beautifully enough to satisfy your vanity, but with enough skill to create something truly magnificent. Sargent seemed like the perfect solution. He had studied with the best teachers in Paris. He could paint with a technical brilliance that left other artists speechless. And perhaps most importantly, he understood his wealthy clients because he had grown up among them. He knew how they thought, how they wanted to be seen, and how to flatter them while creating genuine art. His first major success came with the John Singer Sargent The Daughters of Edward Darley Boyd painting in 1882. 4 young girls in a grand interior painted with such psychological depth that viewers couldn't stop staring. The painting showed Sargent's genius for capturing not just what people looked like, but who they were inside. The older girls seem confident and poised, while the younger ones appear more uncertain, almost lost in the enormous space around them. It was the kind of psychological insight that made wealthy parents both thrilled and nervous about commissioning Sargent. But it was his next portrait that would change everything. In 1883, Sargent met Virginie Amélie Avegno-Gautreau, an American woman who had married a French banker and become one of the most talked-about beauties in Paris society. Everyone called her Madame X though her real name was Madame Pierre Gautreau. She was exactly the kind of subject Sargent loved: striking, confident, and complicated. Madame Gautreau was famous for her pale, almost translucent skin, which she enhanced with lavender powder to give herself an otherworldly appearance. She was also known for her daring fashion choices and her rumored affairs with prominent men around Paris. She represented a new kind of woman, one who created her own identity and refused to follow traditional rules about how society ladies should behave. When Sargent approached her about sitting for a portrait, she agreed, probably thinking it would add to her mystique. What she didn't realize was that Sargent saw something in her that she might not have wanted the world to see. He saw through her carefully constructed image to something more complex and vulnerable underneath. The John Singer Sargent portrait of Madame X painting took over a year to complete. Sargent made dozens of sketches and studies, trying to capture exactly the right pose and expression. In the preliminary drawings, you can see him experimenting with different ways to show her personality. Should she look directly at the viewer with confidence? Should she turn away mysteriously? How much of her famous pale skin should be revealed? The final painting shows Madame Gautreau in profile, wearing a black evening gown with thin jeweled straps. Her skin glows with that famous lavender pallor against the dark background. She holds a fan in one hand and rests the other on a small table. The pose is elegant and sophisticated, but there's something unsettling about it too. She doesn't look directly at the viewer, and her expression seems almost defiant, as if she's daring the world to judge her. But here's where the scandal comes in. In Sargent's original version of the John Singer Sargent portrait of Madame X painting, one of the jeweled straps of her dress had fallen off her shoulder. It was a tiny detail, just a few brush strokes, but it changed everything about how people interpreted the painting. That fallen strap suggested intimacy, sexuality, and a woman who might be coming undressed. In the conservative Paris art world of 1884, it was absolutely shocking. When Sargent submitted the John Singer Sargent portrait of Madame X painting to the Paris Salon in 1884, he expected it to be his masterpiece, the work that would establish him as the premier portrait painter of his generation. Instead, it created a scandal that rocked Parisian society. Visitors to the salon crowded around the painting, not to admire it, but to gossip about it. Newspapers wrote scathing reviews, calling it vulgar and immoral. Critics accused Sargent of deliberately trying to shock the public rather than create serious art. The reaction was so intense that Madame Gautreau's mother actually showed up at the salon and demanded that Sargent remove the painting immediately. She claimed it was ruining her daughter's reputation and threatening her position in society. Other wealthy potential clients began whispering that maybe Sargent wasn't the kind of artist they wanted painting their wives and daughters after all. Sargent was devastated. This was supposed to be his triumph, and instead it had become a disaster that threatened to destroy his career before it had really begun. He quickly painted over the fallen strap, moving it back up onto Madame Gautreau's shoulder, but the damage was already done. The scandal had revealed something uncomfortable about both the painting and the society that rejected it. The truth was, the John Singer Sargent portrait of Madame X painting was actually a brilliant work of art that captured something real about its subject and her world. Sargent had painted Madame Gautreau exactly as she was, a complex, ambitious woman who refused to conform to traditional expectations. The painting's power came from its honesty, but that honesty was exactly what made it so threatening to a society built on maintaining proper appearances. Faced with the collapse of his Paris career, Sargent made a decision that would define the rest of his life. He moved to London, where the art world was more conservative, but also more forgiving of talented outsiders. British high society was fascinated by this American artist who had caused such a stir in Paris, and they were eager to see what he could do with their own portraits. The move to London was exactly what Sargent's career needed. British aristocrats loved his bold painting style and his ability to make them look both elegant and powerful. Unlike the French critics who had been offended by his honesty, British clients appreciated that he could paint them as they wanted to be seen while still creating works of genuine artistic merit. His first major British success was the John Singer Sargent Carnation, Lily Lily Rose painting in 1885 to 1886. Two young girls lighting Japanese lanterns in a garden at twilight, painted with such luminous beauty that it immediately established Sargent as a master of both portraiture and atmospheric effects. The painting showed that he could create works of pure loveliness when he wasn't trying to reveal uncomfortable truths about his subjects. But it was his society portraits that really made his reputation in London. Paintings like the John Singer Sargent Lady Agnew of Lochnar painting in 1892 showed wealthy British women as confident, elegant, and powerful. These weren't the psychological studies that had made his Paris clients uncomfortable. They were celebrations of beauty, status, and refinement that his subjects could hang in their homes with complete pride. Sargent developed a painting technique that seemed almost magical to people who watched him work. He could capture a person's likeness with just a few bold brushstrokes, building up their features with layers of paint that seemed to glow with inner light. His portraits didn't look labored or overworked. Instead, they had a freshness and spontaneity that made his subjects seem alive and present in the room. What made Sargent's portrait so special wasn't just his technical skill, though that was extraordinary. It was his ability to understand exactly what each client needed from their portrait. For some, he emphasized their beauty. For others, their power or intelligence. He could make a plain woman look fascinating and a boring man seem distinguished. He was essentially a magician who used paint and canvas to give people better versions of themselves. By the 1890s, Sargent had become the most sought-after portrait painter in the English-speaking world. Wealthy Americans began traveling to London just to have him paint their portraits. He charged enormous fees, sometimes the equivalent of hundreds of thousands of dollars in today's money, and clients were happy to pay them. Getting a Sargent portrait had become the ultimate status symbol. But here's what's fascinating about Sargent's success. He never forgot the lesson of the John Singer Sargent portrait of Madame X painting. He had learned that there was a difference between painting the truth and painting what people wanted to see. From then on, he gave his clients exactly what they were paying for. Portraits that made them look magnificent without revealing anything that might make them uncomfortable. This doesn't mean his later portraits were dishonest or shallow. Sargent was too great an artist for that. But he learned to channel his psychological insights in ways that flattered rather than challenged his subjects. He could still see through to people's essential character, but he painted the version of that character they most wanted to project to the world. The irony is that the John Singer Sargent portrait of Madame X painting, the work that nearly destroyed his career, is now considered one of his greatest masterpieces. It hangs in the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, where millions of visitors admire exactly the qualities that shocked Paris society in 1884. The painting's psychological complexity, its bold technique, and yes, even its subtle sexuality, are now seen as evidence of Sargent's genius rather than reasons to condemn him. What do you think would have happened to art history if Sargent had never painted that controversial portrait? Would we have gotten the same brilliant society portraits that followed, or did he need that scandal to truly understand his own artistic power? The story of John Singer Sargent and the John Singer Sargent portrait of Madame X painting reminds us that sometimes the most important art is the kind that makes people uncomfortable. Sargent's greatest achievement wasn't learning to paint beautiful portraits that everyone loved. It was creating a work so honest and powerful that it changed how we think about art's relationship to truth, beauty, and society itself.